Hi, everybody. Welcome back. We are going to go into a huge topic today, one that usually students, when they come into classes, have at least some bearing of, some background knowledge of, at least to some extent. Some have a lot deeper knowledge of it. It depends kind of on the courses you've taken and the schools that you've been at and your own personal interest level. But today we're going to talk about the African American Civil Rights Movement. It's a huge topic. It's got its own portion of an objective. It's going to inspire so many other movements, and it's going to be kind of helped and will help bolster other movements, such as the power movements you may have seen or remembered from our last video, like the brown power, pink power, rainbow, yellow, red power movements, all these other social change groups, and the other counterculture groups. There is going to be a lot of complexity that you can bring in here. For example, that there are going to be questions about who is this movement for? Is this for everyone to really help move? Is this a movement that should only be for, by, and of African Americans? Who should really take this charge? Should it only be, for example, in the female civil rights movement? Should it only be women taking a charge in that, or should that also encourage the support of other groups? And it's really going to bring about a lot of complex discussions. So really just remember that none of these key terms are really going to be explicitly in the curriculum. So it's you use them as you need to tell the broader story. The only one that is really explicitly mentioned in the AP curriculum is Martin Luther King Jr., who is a name that is a household name that everybody should know, at least at this point in their operation in the world. And if you don't, we're going to tell you about them a lot more today, and we'll kind of go into that. But everybody may have their own kind of backing, and a lot of the backing will probably be in the nonviolent protest movement or nonviolent resistance movement. But you may have other knowledge of other figures like Malcolm X, or maybe you've heard of the Black Panthers. And we're going to really look to see how this plays into our story. Just like our last video, this is going to be another break from chronology. This is going to be happening at the exact same time as that counterculture hippie movement, free speech movement, all the different power movements, all happening at the exact same time in mostly the 60s, and this is where we're going to see a lot of the biggest change, but also in the 1950s. So we're coinciding all of these things simultaneously, and they're all going to build together and feed off of each other. So we're going to have the political realm, which we've covered in previous videos. We're also going to have that counterculture movement and the student protest movement that really sparks in the 60s, which is where we're going to see the largest amount of tangible legal change. And at the exact same time, we're also going to see this civil rights movement that's going to be coming. A lot of big moments in the 1950s that are going to start to change culture, but then direct enforcement, political involvement, and alignment once we hit the 1960s, when you see the new left really start to carve itself out, the new Democratic Party, and you see major figures like JFK and LBJ. So we're going to hit a lot of different corners today, but we'll start as we always do with our objectives to make sure that we're really thinking in the right direction. We're going to keep talking about this idea of social change and really just keep in mind the world that we live in at this point when we're learning is that discrimination and segregation is really the norm. It's the law of the land. That's the way it's been for quite some time. It's still the law in the books before we really get some major constitutional change. So from 1945, the end of World War II, up until 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan, and this wave of conservative resurgence, the right side of the political spectrum is going to rise up, take massive control in the federal government, and completely start to shape society. It is going to be a liberal wave that's really going to hit in this pocket post World War II. So we're really going to see that. The other thing is really understanding how mass culture is going to play into this. The television is so important. It's going to show these images of brutality that are going to be broadcasted around the country. So even if you do live in a very secluded, high-class, racially segregated neighborhood, a white suburban neighborhood, you're still going to be able to see these race relations and this violence happening, even if you live in an area that there may not be as much racial tension. Maybe there is no racial diversity. That's going to be on your TV screen in your home. We're really going to see how these civil rights movements develop and why they develop, and they're really going to kind of coincide together. And I mentioned this in the counterculture protest video, and we're really going to be looking at how these kind of movements play together. For example, the Chicano movement, Brown Power movement, and the African American civil rights movement will work together along with the Asian American civil rights movement. All of these movements are really going to start to coincide with each other. We're also going to see how this is going to affect our discussion with the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War and kind of LBJ's Great Society are going to be at odds with each other, and a big piece of that is the civil rights movement. So the civil rights movement is going to be forced onto the back burner once the Vietnam War begins, and there's going to be a massive amount of people that are going to feel discontent with the progress and start to radicalize with the civil rights movement to achieve results. We're also going to see kind of this debate about the role of federal government. Should this be a state by state thing that they're deciding about how these civil rights applications should be taking effect? Or is this a top down? Should this be the federal government who's telling us how and what should happen? Other little things, we're talking about the call for civil rights. So why other groups? Today we're going to talk about the African American movement, the largest one or probably the most prominent one in US history, and ways that the government responds. So sometimes it will be direct intervention, sometimes it will be legislation, sometimes it won't really be much response. It will be a lack of response. For example, because of the Vietnam War, attention is going to be stripped away from this movement and given to the war front. And lastly, kind of how we're seeing this change over time with different political values and how it's changing over the 20th century, in addition to kind of shaping national identity. Where are we going and how are all these things coinciding? We'll try to do a little bit review as we go and try to remember what's happening in the time period, but we'll piece by piece kind of put this together. So when we're focusing today, one general question that if you have to break everything down to this, what were some significant individuals and accomplishments of the civil rights movement? Do you have to know every single one for the APUSH exam? Absolutely not. You do not. What's more important when you're taking an AP course, especially the AP US history course, is to understand how these stories fit together. How do you see change or continuity over time? What are causality, right, components that we're looking for? How can we compare things? Seeing the bigger trends. All these specific names are not required unless they're explicitly mentioned in the curriculum, but all of these things will help bolster your claim. So we're going to throw a lot at you today, and we're just going to see what sticks to you. But take that into consideration. If you don't know every single law or legislation, that's okay, right? But as long as you can use it to prove the general theme in the course outline, you'll be totally fine. So the terminology I'm going to use is I'm going to call this the modern civil rights movement. When we're talking about the story, especially with the African American story of the struggle for equality, you can't just say it starts in the middle of the 1950s. It's not that African Americans woke up one day and are like, you know what? I think freedom sounds kind of cool. I think I'm going to try a little bit of that. That's absolutely absurd and ignorant and closed-minded. This has been a protracted struggle since the very first slaves set foot onto this continent at the Jamestown colony. And so there's been a massive struggle and change over time since. This is something you can trace through the entirety of the course. And it's one really, really good example. So we're talking about more modern day, more contemporary examples here in period 8. When we're talking about this starting point, there is one major moment that we can put that is a massive tangible change, and it's Brown versus BOE, which stands for Board of Education. This is a court case that a lot of people are probably more familiar with, and then we will end with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. When we're talking about the context when these changes happen, a lot of African Americans moved to the northern part of the country and the western part of the country for various reasons, for economic equality, trying to escape the Jim Crow South, trying to find better situation. There was the pull of industrial labor during World War II, the Great Migration. But even though they had moved out of these high threatening areas in the South, they still faced many different forms of discrimination, whether it be economic discrimination, it could be segregation into different neighborhoods. And that was a little bit hit and miss. It was very different style of experience than African Americans that were still in the South. Jim Crow law was still the law of the land, and that was kind of the expectation. That was the norm. Segregation was normal in those regions. We are going to see, especially in the South more than anywhere else, there are more chances or opportunities communities in northern areas where there will be some integration to an extent, but that's not to say that there's only racism in the South and not in the North, because that is absolutely not true. It's just going to take a very different form. In the South, everything, right? Absolutely everything is going to be segregated. There were different areas where you could wait depending on the color of your skin. So if you were, say there was 2 rooms, they would say there is a whites only and colored only waiting room. Even if that entire room for people of color was completely filled and you walked in, you could not go into that whites only waiting room, right? You would have to stand at other place. There were separate schools and inherently inferior because the lack of federal funding and support. Separate seats on trains and buses. You couldn't even use the same phone. You couldn't use the same hospitals. You couldn't even drink from the same drinking fountain. Everything is separate, and this goes all the way back to period 6, the court case Plessy versus Ferguson, that legally allows for segregation, legally allows for separate facilities to be separate as long as they are equal. But we know that they will be separate but inherently unequal throughout their time period. When we're looking at this movement to desegregate, it really sort of comes down to finding a purpose and a cause, and finding not an overhaul of all of society, but trying to find one tangible gain. And the very first movement, or the very first target, is going to be education, as this being the tool to help get them out of poverty and help create generational equality, not just for now, but for many generations to come. And the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, this organization founded during the Gilded Age, is really targeting graduate administration, so collegiate level, and Thurgood Marshall, who is a major lawyer for the NAACP and future Supreme Court justice, is going to use this argument of the 14th Amendment to go after school segregation, to go after the precedent that Plessy versus Ferguson set, and really start to change societies by the time we get up to 1954. Now, the other major important thing that we're going to see right now is we're going to see a larger development here where it's going to lead to larger sweeping change. All of these justices that are going to be put up by the time we get to Brown versus the Board of Education, over half of them are going to be heavily liberally leaning, even though this is a massively important case and it's very controversial for its time period. All of the Supreme Court justices that FDR was able to put up in his administration alone, not even to mention the Truman administration, by the time it gets to Eisenhower's administration, there's not really going to be that many seats that are more conservatively leaning after so many very democratically liberal presidents have been in office to appoint these new justices. The argument was that even though you have separate schools, say that these schools are actually equal, which we know they're not, but we're going to work in a world that even if they are equal, this already has this profound psychological damage to African American children, when we know in this world that these are inherently unequal, these schools, that teaching them, ingraining them that they are unequal, inferior people is going to start having deep psychological damage to children of color. And this really leads us to the super famous Supreme Court case. There are very few Supreme Court cases that are explicitly listed in the AP curriculum, and in my mind, there are 3 that I emphasize more than any other in class. The first one is the case Marbury versus Madison, because this allows for the power of judicial review that sets the precedent for all future Supreme Court cases and gives the Supreme Court really its power. Then you have the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which stands very long, and it deeply impacts society for the years that separate but equal rule is standing. And then there's Brown versus the Board of Education that really starts this monumental wave of social reform and social backlash, because all of these different court cases are going to change the political landscape and social landscape. So Brown versus the Board of Education is actually going to overrule this separation. But the important thing to understand here is it's only talking about schools. Only schools will be desegregated. It's going to call for desegregation of schools, and it's going to use this phrasing, and this is super important, you really look at this, with deliberate speed. that is very vague. There is not a concrete timeline. So the southern states are really going to start to drag their heels. A lot of these old border states are going to comply very quickly, but the deep south is heavily going to resist. 6 years into the future, by 1960, less than 1% of Black students attended school with white students. It is that heavily desegregated. It is that heavily resistant. You are going to see people that are going to start to move on a resegregation platform, and let that sink in. Not segregation, bringing people together, resegregation to put it back into place. And so there's going to be this huge questioning of the federal power by the state governments, and it's going to be this deep-rooted movement. It's going to lead to people running for president, governors openly opposing the president of the United States. It's going to create a lot of different forms of tension. So there is a difference between these types of representation in society. So legally, in 1954, schools are desegregated. However, in reality, we know that there is a massive amount of inequality because southern states are refusing to comply. You will see this monumental movement, and this is huge, but this is where complexity comes into play here, folks. We're talking about, yes, there is a constitutional ruling. There's going to be federal laws that are on the books, but in reality, the way things are actually working, this isn't going to be the true state of the United States. They're going to find different ways of trying to finding loopholes. One of them is called pupil placement laws. So what they're going to do is they're going to start placing students into schools based on their aptitude, so by how smart they believe them to be, or their morality, how good they believe them to be. And this is going to start this kind of in between the lines, right? If you're reading in between the lines, you're seeing the hidden message here of ways of discriminating or separating these students apart from each other to keep this segregated community going. It's really going to call that into question. They're going to find ways to try to circumvent the federal rulings and the federal law, so the southern states will not comply. Although there is a law on the books, actual state compliance will not exist for quite some time. You are going to see these major effects moving forward. For example, Thurgood Marshall, who is the argue for the NAACP that leads this case, is actually going to make him the most famous lawyer of color in the United States. And really a decade later, Johnson is going to make him the very first Black Supreme Court justice. And that is going to be another example of monumental change. So there are people being put in positions that never were before. However, is there real tangible change in society? That's what we start to question. So we're going to take a little minute to stop and we're going to play a little game because we really want to ingrain into this idea that just because there are rules and they have these rights, such as, for example, the 15th Amendment, does not mean that individuals actually get to access them. There's a difference between things in society that are de jure and de facto. They're two very different things. We're going to explain what those two Latin terms mean. But we're going to play a little game called the urinal game. What it's going to be is we're going to test how well you understand the etiquette that works in a men's typical bathroom. So for gentlemen, this game may seem very, very, very easy. For the ladies watching this video, this may be extremely confusing. Now understand that there are correct and incorrect answers to this. So you have to select which urinal you have to use. You can do it by number. So for example, if gentlemen walk into the bathroom, there are 5 urinals to use. Which one are they going to take? There is a most correct answer. There's one and two can kind of be the exact same thing when we're talking about the correct answer. The correct answer in this case is 1 and 3 are the best possible options. 5 would be the next best, and 2 and 4 are the least acceptable answers if this was the scenario that you walked into. Now, we'll change the scenario a little bit further. So we're going to change the scenario here a little bit. We're going to pretend that there's already somebody in here. There's a man in the bathroom, already at urinal number 3. So the best possible choice here is we are going to go to number 1. Then the next best would be number 5, and 2 and 4 are terrible, terrible options. Ladies, you may be confused. Gentlemen, this may seem very simple to you. Different scenarios. You're in a public place. There's an individual there with their son. The best option is number 1, then 5, and then 2 is the worst option. You come in again, things are slightly different. Number 5 is the best option, then number 4, then number 2. And lastly, um, in this situation, most individuals, right? Some men, if they're faced with this, some individuals will actually wait rather than pick it. It can be a trick question here, but if you were forced to, you would pick 4 and then possibly 2. But in some cases, some people would just turn around and leave. So in this, there are unspoken rules about what you do and do not do in a men's. When we're talking about this, there are this kind of list of unwritten rules about how you behave. There are things that you just behave. When you are in a men's bathroom, you do not speak. It is very silent. You do not interact with each other when individuals are using the restroom. There is no touching. It is not the way that you act. However, when you look at, say, school handbooks, or you look even in the law of the United States, there is absolutely zero rule that tells you how to behave and which way you do. In a men's bathroom, you always leave a space between an individual whenever at all possible, unless it's an absolute emergency. So there are rules that we would say are de jure, which are by law, there are none. But as a matter of fact, de facto, there are ways about how we actually behave. So are these rules that we actually interact with. So there is the expectation in society at this time that based on these laws, there's full citizenship and access to these rights, but in reality, as a matter of fact, it is very limited. So when we're breaking down these words are both of Latin root. These phrases are de jure, and you may see the word to judge in that, right? According to law, according to the judges, there are absolutely no laws that tell men how to pick which urinal to use when they go to the bathroom. However, we know that people behave in a very certain way. As a matter of fact, they leave one space between each other in the bathroom whenever possible. So there is de jure, according to law. There are no laws. But as a matter of fact, we know that there is a behavior, there's social rules, social consequences. If you break these rules, people will not want to interact with you. People will become very, very uncomfortable. People will alienate themselves from you and they will not want to be around you, especially in a bathroom setting. So let's take this back to history now, right? Actually apply this, see where this long road is going. According to Brown versus Board of Education, all schools are now to be integrated. According to the 15th Amendment, all African Americans have the full access to the right to vote and they cannot be denied. However, many southern states did not comply with either of these rules and they used many different tactics to resist this order. So whether it were different qualifications of morality or aptitude that they would apply to keep African Americans or any students of color out of white schools, maybe making random entrance tests that would be scored very differently depending on the color of your skin, or if you have the 15th Amendment, things like literacy tests, ways of actually preventing African Americans from accessing the right to vote or being forced to pay in order to vote, poll taxes. There's all these different ways that we've seen ever since kind of that Reconstruction period, that post-Civil War period until now. The Civil War ended in 1865. We are creeping on 90 years when Brown versus the Board of Education is passed. It's 89 years after the Civil War has ended, and we just put a legislation out, a Supreme Court ruling out that actually desegregates all schools. That is not even being applied. So based on law, yes, this happened. Just like today, based on law, there is no ability to discriminate against other people based on their race, their gender, or ethnicity. But we know that people are mistreated in the world all around us. So as a matter of law, according to law, these things don't exist. They can't exist. We know as a matter of fact, they most definitely do. Inequality is very rampant. So you can follow the track of laws, and then we can also follow the track about how things are actually happening. So let's bump out to Brown versus the Board of Education. Eisenhower didn't really speak out against Brown versus the Board of Education when it was happening. And the kind of original message was that if you weren't actively supporting this integration, then you were actually supporting segregation, which wasn't necessarily the case with Eisenhower. And it really comes to a crossroads in 1957. The Arkansas governor called the National Guard as like for a state of emergency to prevent black students from enrolling at a high school, Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. to counter that government action. The governor has called the National Guard to block off the schools to prevent these students of color from walking into the high school to attend school, which is legally guaranteed by Brown versus Board of Education 3 years ago. And they're calling the National Guard to block them off. In response, Eisenhower is going to send in the Air Force and the Army used to force integration. The federal government and the state governments are going to have to stand off. And these group of students, these group of 9 students, are going to be called the Little Rock Nine. This is the governor of Arkansas at the time, Governor Orville Falbus. Very unfortunate name, and I guess very unfortunate individual. But there is going to be massive protests. You can see these signs in this photo saying race mixing is communism, stop the race mixing, stop bringing these students together. Parents pulled their children out of classes. There was a lot of tension, people protesting. These are the Little Rock Nine that actually wanted to go. They're just teenagers that want to go to a high school. They're being told to integrate into this new high school that has better facilities for them. And they're very apt students. These aren't kids that are troublemakers. They're higher performing students. They're very good students. They behave well, and they're still facing a lot of this discrimination. To make things more complicated, one of the girls was late, so they would meet and they would rendezvous at one of the houses of one of the 9 children, and the National Guard then would transport them into the school and protect them. One girl showed up late, and she walked into school despite this massive angry mob behind her coming after her. This woman here in the back, you can see with her mouth wide open, screaming. She's yelling racial slurs, telling them to go home. And what's going to happen is later in life, actually, Oprah Winfrey on her talk show is actually going to bring them together, and you can take a look at that. But what's going to happen? They're going to force these students, they're going to walk these students into this school. And you can even see the armed forces literally escorting these children just to go to class into this high school. There is going to be a massive amount of backlash. Parents are going to be pulling their kids out left and right. And so this will not be an easy change. There is going to be massive resistance in the Deep South, and this is 3 years after this law was passed. So this story is going to continue to build up. This is not the last we hear of the civil rights movement. It's not going to be accepted right away. The AP curriculum does require you to understand that there is a massive amount of Southern resistance as well. The next big example of change following Brown is there is going to be a movement by individuals. Instead of waiting for the government to really take a charge on this, they're going to try to change the de facto way that society exists. And one of the most quintessential early examples of this movement is something called the Montgomery bus boycott. Many of you learned this story in elementary school. A woman by the name of Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat in a public bus in Montgomery. And what is going to happen is it's going to start a massive form of resistance. She is going to be arrested for refusing to give her seat up to a white passenger. That the rule was that blacks were forced to sit in the back and whites could sit in the front. But if all seats were full, then white passengers could go and they could take any seat they wanted that was filled by a black passenger and tell them to get up. It wasn't a request, it was required an issue, and she refused. Rosa Parks becomes kind of the face of this early movement, and African Americans successfully bind together. They're going to have to sacrifice in order to really get this boycott done. They're going to refuse to use the public busing system, and because they are the lowest end of socioeconomic status, African Americans are going to make up the largest proportion of individuals, especially in urban centers, that are using public transportation. If they refuse to use public transportation, the city is going to start losing massive amounts of money. So they're going to try to put the pressure on these cities and these towns to remove these restrictions and these laws by hurting them where it hits most. It hits hardest, their wallet. They're going to carpool together in order to get to work. Many people are going to be forced to walk. The Supreme Court is going to get involved and rule that the Alabama bus segregation rules are unconstitutional. So they're going to get that repealed. And you're also going to see the upstart of a very, very young minister from Atlanta, Georgia, that's going to rise as a famous civil rights leader in the years to come, Martin Luther King Jr. He is going to join in this movement and become this symbol, this young symbol of progress. These are our photos of individuals actually getting back on these buses in Montgomery. Rosa Parks was arrested, and this famous photo that's been colorized now of her getting her fingerprints recorded, but she was charged with a crime. Rosa Parks was not just this random old lady, though. She had been protesting for decades, but this is really where it kind of comes to light. Even after Brown divorced the Board of Education, there's still public segregation everywhere. Brown versus Board of Education only touches schools, though. It's really important to understand this is change over time. This is complexity. It only starts with schools, and it's going to translate much later on to other public facilities. They're going to carpool together. Church communities are going to work together to help get to other places. You're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be protesting there. He's going to be elected, but you can't force these people to take the bus. So they break the will down of the state governments to get them to repeal the laws. So individuals start to see that with a nonviolent protest movement, they are actually able to successfully create change if it's well organized. But the problem is with this massive nonviolent resistance movement, violence is still extremely, extremely common. But with the advent of newer technology in the 1950s, like the television and the common household ownership of a television, allows for the production and distribution of all of this information out to the American public. And when very violent acts against peaceful protesters are captured on television and shared all throughout the country, every single individual that has a television can watch these things happen, see these events happen, be emotionally shooken by these terrible, terrible events, even if they're not actually there. You're going to see the KKK rising again to being a major force once again in politics. We saw them post Civil War. We saw them again in the 1920s heavily resisting immigration in the 1920s, but kind of go away because of the Great Depression and World War II. But they're going to come back with a vengeance, kind of the KKK 3.0 we're going to see in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s as a reaction to this conquest for civil rights in this fight. So many different individuals are going to be threatened with their very livelihoods are going to be threatened by this movement. You're going to see people publicly lynched still. There are going to be very violent actions going against African Americans, and we saw heavy lynching in the early 1900s, but the threat of death is still very, very real. There are still laws in different states where African Americans aren't able to really protest or really speak out in a safe environment without a threat on their life. You're going to see people publicly executed. Now, this is a much older photo, but understand the history of violence towards African Americans is very, very, very common. So this is not a new development, but it's something that is a very real threat. It's not just speaking your mind, you're going to be protected. You won't. You could easily lose your life. And so this kind of martyrdom movement is really going to take place where a lot of individuals are going to give their life for this cause. They're willing to even die for this conquest of equality or this quest for equality. A great example of this is the story of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was accused of grabbing and whistling a white woman at a grocery store. And then what happens is a group of gentlemen come by who are related to this woman he allegedly grabbed and whistled at. They're going to take him, they're going to beat him, they're going to torture him, and then they're going to throw his body in a river. And when it's discovered, his body is going to have taken on so much water and the corpse will have started to float that he won't even be recognizable. These are the two men that actually did it. Now, the woman said that she was whistled and grabbed. There was no African Americans that were able to submit testimony in the court of law according to the state rules. These two men said, we didn't do it, we didn't do it. And then afterwards, they were acquitted of this crime. After they were acquitted, they went on record and said, yes, absolutely, we did it. The woman who said that she was grabbed said that she was told to lie and she willingly lied under oath. And this young boy, his body and his face is going to turn into this. These are very extreme cases, but these movements are going to become kind of like a calling card in the United States of the people that gave their lives for this movement. And understand that this doesn't happen like decades and decades ago. This isn't the turn of the 1900s. This happened in 1955, 1 year after Brown versus the Board of Education. So tensions are very, very high when we're talking about race relations. As MLK really gains popularity and uses the events of kind of what happened to Emmett Till and the Montgomery bus boycott, he is going to start to form sort of a committee to help go after segregation across this country. This isn't just a local thing. This is going to start becoming a national movement where he's going to go to different places of intense segregation to try to change the state of things. You may have seen this if you've ever seen the movie Selma. It depicts Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference well in that regard. They are going to heavily use MLK's great speaking skills. He was a Baptist minister, and you're going to see a lot of religious connections to a lot of these individuals that are involved, really to support African Americans' cause, to really rally people. And his message is going to be nonviolent resistance, peaceful resistance. The ideal that Christian love is going to prevail and be the basis for these efforts. Now, notice this is not pacifism, right? Pacifism means you won't fight back or resist in any way, shape, or form. Nonviolent resistance, or peaceful resistance, as sometimes it's called, is purposely going to agitate and question and try to fight other people's compassion to do evil, to do ill with peace, not fighting back, but purposely going to agitate. And so MLK will really push for that. But many will question his methods as these decades go on. This sort of kind of verse from the Bible of like turning the other cheek, or if cursed, do not curse back. If struck, do not strike back, but evidence love and goodwill at all times. We will match your capacity to endure suffering. We will match your physical force with soul force. We will not hate you, but we will not obey your evil laws. So it's not just lying down here, right? We're not fighting back, but we're questioning and pushing against these laws. We will wear you down by pure capacity to suffer. We will overcome. And even Martin Luther King Jr. himself is going to face severe attacks, burning crosses in his yards, bomb threats, questions and assaults on his life are going to happen until eventually he will be killed at the end of the 1960s and 1968. So this is just one example of a lot of change. So we're going to see Martin Luther King Jr. really inspire so many people. His name is explicitly in the AP curriculum, so he's a name that we should get comfortable with, and hopefully a name that we do already know a decent amount about. Let's take it to the 60s. So in the 60s, we're really going to see more examples of early activism. People are going to lead protests. One of the most famous types of protests are called sit-ins. So students at universities across the country are going to be protesting. If you remember the free speech movement, even African Americans pushing for civil rights, not just free speech. At a university in North Carolina, NCANT, they're going to start to question lunch counter segregation. So at the time, you could not go into restaurants and even sometimes use the same door, let alone sit at the same place. The lunch counters, the countertops where you could sit right up by where the grill is or the service center, you could not sit in certain sections. So what they would do is they would lead a form of protest called a sit-in. What they would do is they would go and they would sit in these supposed to be segregated areas and just try to order a cup of coffee and try to order lunch. And they would refuse to leave, right, until they were served, and they're going to face severe amount of backlash. Some places will completely close down. They are going to face severe amounts of threats on their lives, and it's going to really start to spark another movement of just trying to go into these segregated places. There were things called sit-ins. There were wade-ins, so going into pools, kneel-ins. Remember, everything is segregated. Even churches, despite this idea that we're all made in the eye of God, racism and segregation is still there too. There were black-only Christian churches and white-only Christian churches, especially all across the South. This is going to lead to a more student-centered protest movement. So there's going to be the SCLC, and then there's also going to be the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or also known as SNCC. all of these groups that are really starting to form, these protest groups, are going to are going to surpass the NAACP. It's no longer going to be about legal progress, because we've seen that, but it hasn't really changed the de facto scenario for a lot of people. These individuals are going to take this and they're going to start to run with it. This is going to be the leadership of the civil rights movement. It's going to be a grassroots movement creating change. All of this is going to be this difference, and I really highlight this for one important reason. We are moving from legal action, just laws, to actual nonviolent protest, trying to change the way things actually are, questioning discrimination in the streets in their real lives, not just on paper, because they saw Brown versus Board of Education, and it didn't really affect things in the Deep South, which is where most of this discrimination, or not most, but I will say the deepest examples of clear obvious examples of discrimination are going to be present in their face, in their lives. This is an example of some of the sit-ins that are happening in Greensboro, and they would go to these counters and just try to order lunch, but they're going to be faced with angry crowds that are coming around them. They're going to spit at them. They're going to pour things on them. They're going to attack them. Massive crowds are going to form. Some people are going to be pulled to the ground. They're going to be stomped on. You can check out a look at this clip right here. I'll take you to the middle of a documentary that will show what these sit-ins would actually be like and what violence these people would encounter. And it's very, very scary. All they were trying to do is order a cup of coffee or a sandwich at a lunch counter, and this is the discrimination they're going to face. Some places will even close. And look what that sign says: for the interest of public safety. That integration is going to be this absolute threat to safety. And if you look at these pieces of metal all throughout this photo here, they literally removed the seats at these counters so that people couldn't even sit down here. Some places closed their restaurant for a while to try to stop this swell of attempt of people trying to sit in at these restaurants. Because of these sit-ins, there's going to be a massive amount of people that are going to be heavily jailed. All these African Americans and other people that may have joined them, but mostly African Americans that are going to be sitting in. And so jails are going to start to overflow. So then they're going to put heavy pressure on the criminal justice system, that they're literally not going to have room for all these people that are being arrested for trying to integrate a segregated lunch counter. These people are doing the right thing, right? They're questioning inequality around them, but they will be labeled as criminals, and that's going to heavily be used in the media narrative of that time period. They're going to be questioning laws. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested so many times, but the law is not always just. We teach children, especially people at a young age, to follow rules, that they're a good thing to do, but that's not always just, especially when the law is unjust. Like I said, there are other examples of protests. We saw these sit-ins at lunch counters. There are swim-ins, there are segregated beaches and pools, there are kneel-ins at segregated churches, drive-ins, there are segregated motels, study-ins, there are segregated universities. All of these are examples of questioning the status quo and trying to create change. Everything in society is segregated. Even though education is technically desegregated, there is still a heavy issue with schools, and there are movements for that. But all other aspects of society are still 100% legally segregated. This is an example of people trying to go to a white-only beach and swimming in the wrong area of the water, or being on the wrong side of the beach or the wrong area of the beach, that they literally segregated chunks of land where people could go into the ocean. That's the level that we're talking about. We even see this in 1964 in St. Augustine, where people are going in to pools to try to desegregate pools. They call them swim-ins. Now, this individual is pouring something into the pool, and at first glance, it's really hard to tell what's exactly going on. This man does not look too happy, and you also look at the face of these individuals that are screaming, like this woman right down here that's in the pool right now. Her face, she looks like she's in extreme pain, screaming for help. What could this man possibly be pouring in? It looks like he's pouring in a bottle of water. He's actually pouring in acid into the pool. This is the level of tension that is happening, that there is violence, outbreaks all over of people trying to peacefully desegregate these areas. So this is the level we're really getting to. There are other examples of the civil rights movement, and it's really going to start slow. So in the 1960s, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, that's kind of built up by A. Philip Randolph, the leader of the Double V campaign in World War II, is going to lead a freedom ride in 1961. They're going to protest segregated buses and segregated areas for or segregated areas in the United States by going deep into sections of the Deep South. They are going to try to question these areas, and they're going to break bans on enrollment of Black students at Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, and the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa. And they're going to go all through the South. So if you look at these lines here on this map, you're going to see all these different paths that they take. And this shows you what dates they were going: December 1st, right, November 29th, November 1st, all these different years over the year 1961 to these different regions, the different places they went. They went deep, deep, deep into the South. And there are a lot of cases of violence. In this case, 9 arrested and released, 306 jailed in Mississippi, 4 jailed in Arkansas at Little Rock. People jailed and arrested, jailed and arrested. They're going to get in these buses and they're going to go all throughout the South. Blacks and whites alike together, questioning and calling for reform. Cities are going to know they're coming. There are going to be armed kind of police forces that are going to be blocking the road to prevent these people from getting through. And in even some cases, it's going to lead to violent actions. Bombs are going to be thrown in, firebomb thrown into this bus. It's going to break it, destroy it, and now they're stranded deep in the South. A lot of people are going to be assaulted physically. They're not going to be protected by the local police force necessarily. And many different people are going to be questioning and fighting for justice. Even individuals of all different walks of life. You can see, for example, in this photo, a white man here. You can see all these other different people of color, or this individual here in the second row on the far right, a clergyman. We're going to see all these different people questioning walks of life. A lot of younger individuals, but there are some mixed generational movements. But these young individuals, they don't really have anything to lose. They don't have a lot of personal property, like maybe older individuals in their 50s and 60s have saved up for their life. So a lot of these younger people are really going to take on this conquest and this movement for change that you're going to see in so many different areas, not just here. We saw this with the free speech movement on different college campuses as well. Different universities are going to be ordered by the federal government to desegregate their schools by order of Brown versus the Board of Education and federal initiatives. And there are going to be students that are going to take that federal order, that desegregation notice, and hold burnings of them and hold rallies. And you see them holding up the Confederate flags here in this photo. You're even going to see at the University of Alabama, Governor George Wallace is literally going to stand in the way physically to try to block students entering into the University of Alabama. Now, if you've ever seen the movie Forrest Gump, he gets involved in this scene and you kind of watch this happen. But George Wallace is a huge figure. I like him as an example of a lot of social change and political change, because he is even going to take it where he is going to run for president about 4 times. He is going to be a huge vocal force that you're going to see in the civil rights movement, trying to block, right, a governor of a state trying to block and resist the federal government, whether that be JFK, whether that be Ike, or especially LBJ. And you're going to see that. And if you've ever seen the movie Selma, he is depicted in that movie as well. This is another photo of Wallace being removed out of the way and the first Black student being allowed to register for classes at the University of Alabama. Now, we've talked about JFK before, and JFK campaigned for civil rights, but he was really fearful of how he is going to fare re-election in 1964 if he doesn't have support of Democrats in the South, because segregation is a huge issue in the South, which is why many people didn't touch it. Think about the early 1800s, how people responded to the discussion on slavery. They didn't really want to touch that because that was kind of like the scarlet letter that could brand them and alienate them from politics, possible re-election. You are going to try to see different people take this role so JFK doesn't have to sort of dirty his hands and meddle in this issue. He's going to let Congress kind of have these laws, and he's not going to press for these issues necessarily himself, and he's going to even have his brother Robert Kennedy, who is going to be a huge champion for civil rights, Bobby Kennedy, who is eventually going to be assassinated later, to take this. The Attorney General is his position, so he's really taking this big prosecuting role and try to help African Americans in the South, but he himself is not going to take on that role. He's dealing with things in Berlin, he's dealing with things in Vietnam, he's dealing with things in Cuba, and he's trying to pass that buck to other areas. Really, when it comes down to it, he's going to have the Justice Department that's going to help, but the FBI really can't protect any of these all of these civil rights activists that are going into the South, really questioning the status quo. So he's going to have a very, very difficult time. JFK really isn't going to do a whole lot himself, despite his campaign promises. An example of these violence actions that happen. One example in 1963, so this is the same year that JFK is assassinated in the Cuban Missile Crisis. In Birmingham, Alabama, there's going to be a bomb that's going to be set off at the baptistry on 16th Street, sometimes called the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, and 4 girls are going to be killed on a Sunday morning trying to go to mass. This is going to spark outrage that there's no kind of protection for individuals, that even small innocent children trying to go to church are being targeted, that not even holy sites are really being protected. You're going to have different homes, not just churches, but homes are going to be firebombed. Over 20,000 people are going to be arrested. So this is not going quietly into the night. This is not something that people are just willing to kind of accept. And so the tensions continue to rise in the 1960s. The death of these 4 girls at the 16th Street bombing, for example, in Birmingham is going to absolutely kind of electrify the civil rights movement, that no one is safe, that this is what the state is coming to, that this is how severe the Southern resistance is becoming, bombing churches and killing 4 innocent young girls on a Sunday morning. These events after this bombing are really only going to intensify things, and Martin Luther King Jr. Is going to actively and openly try to support these questioning movements, and so he is going to take his movement to Birmingham in this huge march to the capital city, the state capital in Alabama. He is going to face massive amount of resistance from the police commissioner in the area, Bull Connor, who uses a lot of brutal force to try to end these protests. Martin Luther King Jr. is going to be jailed along with many of these marchers, but this is going to be a pivotal point in the conquest for civil rights, in this fight, this struggle for civil rights. It's going to really start to sway public sentiments, and the leaders surrounding King and King himself really begins to utilize this massive amount of violence and brutal force that's used by these people that are trying to stop them, to really sway public sentiment that these people are innocently being assaulted, brutally assaulted, and with these images captured and sent on TVs all around the country, it's really going to push and allow for Kennedy to really begin moving for civil rights legislation. And because of that public sentiment that happens at Birmingham, it really changes that story. You are going to see people in Birmingham that are shot with fire hoses, extremely high forces that are going to rip off skin and cause severe damaging and pain. They're going to have attack dogs used on kind of college students, if you will, that are protesting, that are attacked by German shepherds. Pictures like this are getting all around the country. You're even going to see Martin Luther King draft his famous letter from a Birmingham jail that is really going to be used to explain and articulate why the nonviolent protest is so important to the civil rights movement. And really this idea and this concept that he really rallies around: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. That we must go wherever there is this darkness in the world to question it, to challenge it, and to try to create a better place. Probably one of the most famous moments in the civil rights movement early on is the March on Washington. So all of these different African American civil rights groups, CORE, the SCLC led by King, the NAACP, and SNCC, all are going to organize this march, literally a march on Washington, D.C., to pressure the government to push for civil rights legislation, a Civil Rights Act. This is not the first time marches have happened. The KKK has even had rallies and marches on Washington. You're going to see the Bonus Army after World War I have it. You are going to see this threat of a march by A. Philip Randolph in the Double V campaign. So there's all of these examples of this doing in the past, and there actually have been some examples of positive change that came from it. This is where Martin Luther King is going to give his famous "I Have a Dream" speech, really pushing for equality. And you're going to see the Kennedy administration being very, very responsive, and they're going to lay down the framework for the Civil Rights Act. However, Kennedy himself is never going to be able to actually do that because he is going to be assassinated. And so that's going to fall on the shoulders and the legacy of Johnson. This is a picture at the National Mall in Washington, D.C., him giving that famous speech. And you can actually listen to recordings. And it's on YouTube, and you can hear that actual speech and how powerful that major speech is. Problem is, there's going to be the Kennedy assassination. And even though this is a very, very negative event, that Kennedy is going to be killed, it's going to create this big energy behind it to push things like legislation, a Civil Rights Act, and then eventually the Voting Rights Act, pass it in his honor. So although it is terrible that Kennedy was assassinated, his death created so much massive social change. So after JFK was assassinated, LBJ kind of picks up that mantle and carries it on, and it really becomes a key feature of LBJ's presidency. So this becomes one of the few key pieces of the Great Society that actually makes a lot of progress. But there's going to be a reason why there's going to be a little bit of failure to actually fulfill all of these goals. But some of the earlier successes that you're going to see in 1964, we're actually going to amend the Constitution, ratifying a banning of poll taxes that inhibited a lot of people from, or prohibited rather, a lot of people from actually being able to vote because of economic constraints. And people had to choose if they were going to actually try to exercise the right to vote, or people that are on the lower end of the socioeconomic status, especially those people of color, if they're going to spend their money on that, or if they're going to spend it on trying to pay their high rents or to feed their family. But in 1964, probably the biggest piece of legislation that's passed, because this really opens up this discussion of desegregation, is the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the Civil Rights Act of 1964 declares all forms of segregation in public facilities illegal. This is essentially the end of almost all Jim Crow laws. The only things that are really remaining are voting rights restrictions. This is a huge step forward. Brown versus the Board of Education desegregates public schools. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 actually desegregates all other public facilities. So Plessy versus Ferguson has basically all but been dissolved at this point. You see the desegregation of all these facilities, but there are still many other voting rights restrictions that are still being put in place, which is a huge piece. These people are passing legislation. These people are getting support for these areas that you live in, your state's funding. And so making sure that you have advocates is really, really important. This is gonna start to culminate in more success as we continue to see this actual change. In 1964, it's going to be dubbed the Freedom Summer. There's going to be this massive movement to register thousands of Black people in Mississippi to actually be registered to vote so they could actually exercise it. So there's huge pressure being put on the state governments, not just the federal government. And you are going to see the focus of the movie Selma really take place, and why this moment is so pivotal. A massive protest march in Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, the state capital, is going to lead to a massive amount of police violence. And all of this violence is going to shock people all around the country because it's going to be captured on television. This one particular event called Bloody Sunday, where there are so many innocent protesters that are clubbed, that are beaten, that are thrown to the ground, that are gassed like criminals, and ultimately it's going to be captured and broadcasted around all these different major news networks, even in the North, where they're not seeing as much of this deep tension. It's going to pull even more regional support when different people living in the suburbs are actually able to see this violence happening. And you cannot ignore it once you see it. There are people that are going to face severe forms of violence, even if they're not a person of color themselves, people helping this movement. This man, for example, is going to be jailed for carrying a placard that says vote register worker, trying to register different people for voting. He got 5 days in jail for carrying that. You're going to see different people from different faiths start to come and support this movement. Different clergymen are going to be called in by Martin Luther King Jr. to try to rally in different types of support, such as the Jewish community. This rabbi was beaten with a tire iron, that piece of equipment that's used to take off the nuts and the bolts on the side of the tires that hold them in. This giant solid piece of iron is going to be used to bludgeon this rabbi, this holy man. And so all of these examples of violence, they're not just going to be people of color, but white individuals that are willing to take up this mantle and suffer too. This is a huge change. You're going to see different kind of questions, though. We're going to see people moving sometimes towards a much more radical movement after we get to the later part of the 1960s. They're going to be encouraging people to speak out, encouraging people to do something about it, right? If you just sit there and you allow this to happen, as this quote says, then damn your souls. We're going to see people trying to register to vote, but realize that it's not just physical punishment that could be a problem for a lot of these individuals. It could also be economic ways of trying to constrain and restrict people from votes. If blacks registered to vote, in some cases, the local banks could call on the loan for their home or their farm, and that could put them out of any form of business, any form of living. And so people really had to question, was this worth it? And a lot of people were too scared to register because they were fearful of the repercussions of these actions. You're going to see this big movement of voter registration equality in Selma, Alabama in 1965, and this is going to be a national known event. They're going to walk across this famous bridge on their march towards Montgomery, and they're going to be met with police violence, with clubs and weapons and gas masks and horses, and it's going to be broadcasted around the country. People are going to see what happens here at Bloody Sunday, and you won't be able to ignore this inequality anymore when these peaceful protesters are bludgeoned by these armed forces. You can actually see some of the raw clips here by checking out this link. This is the type of stuff that was pushed around the country. So you have a couple things going on here. One, you have organized movements for civil rights. You see this protest movement that is taking a more grassroots, people-motivated movement. And three, we see the impact of technology on society. All of these things are working together at the same moment. So there's many different objectives we can hit by looking at some of these events, like Bloody Sunday. Ultimately, the Selma March helps lead to Congress and Johnson pushing forward the Voting Rights Act of 1965. To me, this is one of the most important pieces of legislation that you have to know about the civil rights movement. It's one of those things. You got Brown versus the Board of Education. You can talk about the Civil Rights Act, which extends that to all other areas of society. But the Voting Rights Act, to me, is super important, because this is a movement that bans those literacy tests. It sends federal officials into the South to protect these voters, to not just say you have the right, de jure, right? But de facto, we are going to ensure that you actually get that opportunity to vote. Protection from the federal government. Eventually, this protest movement is going to call and actually achieve governmental change. And this was really what the radical Republicans had imagined and envisioned back in Reconstruction era, back in Period 5. And remember, the number one reason why Reconstruction is usually deemed as an ultimate failure is because of not only the resistance of the South, but the waning resolve of the North and of the federal government. It was a lot of expenditures, it was a lot of government oversight, it was a lot of government control, and in the mid-1800s, that was not anything that people were willing to do. Now, after a series of change in views of the government from FDR until LBJ, this is going to be the first real piece of legislation that actually brings to light what these radical Republicans wanted back in the 1800s. And it's also a very symbolic year when you think about it. 1965 is 100 years after the Civil War ended in this country and what it was fought over. It took 100 years to actually achieve voting equality. You can see a huge force in voting patterns, that this is going to create a massive wave of change for the following decades of today, where African Americans become a huge force in politics. right after the Civil War, we can think about what happened where black voters became this huge voter pool that helped keep Republicans in power, like Grant. But as the Jim Crow laws were enacted and more of these restrictions were enacted, it really prevented them from actually being able to exercise that right to vote. And so this is the first major time you can actually see this. Now, if you look at these maps up here, this is the Deep South. The percentage of the voting age blacks that are actually registered to vote. So everybody that is of voting age, what percentage is actually registered to vote? Look at Louisiana and Mississippi and Alabama and South Carolina. Less than 1% of all black individuals that are of age to vote in 1940, a year after World War II really begins. That's how few African Americans are actually registered to vote. Now look in 1964, the year before this happens, the big voting rights movement. Mississippi is still heavily far behind, only 6.7%. There's change here, but 1968, 3 years after the Voting Rights Act, we have people in the 80s, 70s, all throughout the 60s, everybody over 50% here now. And then flash forward to 1976, right? That's just about a decade past this legislation. Look how high the percentage of African Americans that can vote are actually registered. You can also look at the total percent. In 1940, 3% of African Americans that could of age that could actually vote were actually registered. By the time you get to 1976, 63.1% are registered. That is massive, tangible change. You can also look at this map, and you're going to see two different numbers here. I'm going to erase these little red marks. You are going to see, number one, the amount of African Americans registered in 1960, and number two, the amount of African Americans registered in 1966. So 1960 is the election of JFK. 1966 is 2 years after the Voting Rights Act was passed. 1 year after the Voting Rights Act was passed, and 2 years after the Civil Rights Act. Now, this is important because 1966 is a midterm election year, so this is going to drastically change the political landscape. So you will see here first in red the amount of voters when JFK was elected versus the percentage of voters that were elected or the percentage of African American voters that were registered to vote during the midterm election of 1966. You can see all these examples of massive change. Mississippi is the most extreme, but also South Carolina. You are going to see progress all throughout this country. That percentage, that number you see, is the percentage of increase in these areas. So Mississippi from 1960 to 1966 had a 695.4% increase in the number of black voters that are registered. However, as extraordinary as that is, 1965, the Voting Rights Act of 1965, is the last tangible, significant civil rights movement gain that we really see. Moving forward, there are some subtle pieces of legislation, there are some social changes, yes, but it is not going to see, it being the civil rights movement, is not going to see the amount of change it saw in the late 50s and early 60s that it will afterwards. It's actually going to be the opposite. And many people are going to start to give up the nonviolent protest movement, and they are going to replace it with much more violent means or much more aggressive, escalated means. And this is an exact copy and paste from the AP objectives. So as these resistance slow, and there was a lot of conflict and resistance, there is going to be a movement from nonviolent protest to a more violent protest. There are going to be a lot of questions about this. And there were many leaders at the same time as Martin Luther King, like Malcolm X. You see a picture of him here. We're going to talk about him. But there was a movement going at the same time, but they were sort of split. After 1965, a more violent means or a much more aggressive forward means is going to take place and move away from the non-violence movement. They're going to really look at it as it's kind of paved its course. It had its role, but now that role is done. We need more drastic measure. And probably the most well-known example of people that question the nonviolent protest movement is a man by the name of Malcolm X. Now, his birth name is Malcolm Little. He experiences a lot of racism. He actually lives in the North. He works in Boston at a famous hotel. But after getting into some run-ins with the law and some crime, and he becomes radicalized while in prison, he is going to really kind of reject these ideas of nonviolent protest because he's seen racism in the North. It's very, very different than racism in the South. And his experience shows him that it's not going to shake up the status quo in the North unless there's more extreme action. He's going to go to the extent where he's going to remove his last name, Little, as he calls it, a slave name, a name all the way back to the dates when his ancestors were slaves, and that this gave rejection and kind of rebirth, if you will, of culture and embracing his blackness. He is going to really advocate the use of weapons for self-defense. Now, understand what self-defense means. This doesn't mean that they're going to go out and they're going to start shooting up places or they're going to start pushing for violence, but they're going to advocate for, if we are attacked, that we should be able to defend ourselves. And if we are being nonviolent, all we're doing is we are encouraging whites to be violent towards us because they know that there is going to be zero ramifications for these actions. So what we're going to do really quickly is we're going to look at a little compare and contrast of MLK versus Malcolm X, because these are two of the biggest figures of the civil rights movement and the most well-known, because they are the leaders of opposite camps. So you could describe the civil rights movement under Martin Luther King Jr. However, if you want complexity, you could compare and contrast that not everybody believed in the nonviolent protest movement and bring up other examples and other groups into an essay on the civil rights movement. That could be a really good way to do that. So let's start with Malcolm X. Malcolm X is much more militant. He really pushes and kind of symbolizes this idea of the Black Power movement. Now, he doesn't coin that term, but he kind of becomes the symbol for it. The defense of African American rights was very important, and not just kind of accepting this violence, that you could only improve your conditions if you took more drastic actions. He does have a little bit of a criminal background. He went to jail, and there he converted to the Nation of Islam, that were stressing that this idea that white people were the devils, and that there was this idea that black nationalism really needs to be on the rise. But he is going to break from this. He's going to travel to Mecca. He's going to travel to Saudi Arabia. He's going to travel to Africa. And when he comes back, he is going to have these more radical ideas, be very outspoken. Now, towards the end of his life, Malcolm X is going to start to change his philosophy. And before the Selma March, he's going to try to meet with King. But he is going to really try to push for a different idea towards the end of his life, and see sort of this change in time, where he's going to sort of more adopt the King's style of belief, saying that his maybe was not achieving the same goals as King's were. And in 1965, he's actually going to be assassinated as well. So this is going to create a huge rift and a huge stumbling block for this more militant movement. But he becomes a huge symbol for that side of the civil rights movement, a group that questions the effectiveness of the nonviolent protest movement. This is one little quote from Malcolm X in 1964. "I believe in the brotherhood of man, all men, but I don't believe brotherhood with anybody who doesn't want brotherhood with me. I believe in treating people right, but I'm not going to waste my time trying to treat somebody right who doesn't know how to return the treatment." That these people do not want to change their heart. If they don't want to, they won't. And so that is his huge problem, that by laying down, that all you're doing is enabling this mistreatment. Meanwhile, on the other hand, you're going to have Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He's a Baptist minister. He's a major speaker, obviously a big social activist, just like Malcolm X, but it comes from a very different background. He is really going to inspire a lot of things. He's going to be involved with some major movements. The two earliest ones that he's known for is Montgomery bus boycott, that kind of puts him on the map, and his famous March on Washington, which leads to his "I Have a Dream" speech. Now, King is famous for his nonviolent resistance movement that is going to be inspired by the work of Gandhi, and it's going to be inspired by the teachings and the practice of Jesus Christ. Martin Luther King's famous speech is going to kind of reverberate throughout the country. This "I Have a Dream" speech, that one day people of all color can work together, that children of all color can be playing together, that his children be playing together with children of different colors of every different race around the world. He's even going to win a Nobel Peace Prize. Um, his big push was that there has to be sacrifice. Without struggle, there is no progress. And he really emphasized this idea of suffering for justice, that you're going to have to be a martyr. You're going to have to give things up if you want this to work. This could mean prison. It even could mean the loss of lives. So for the Montgomery bus boycott, you're going to have to suffer and you're going to have to walk everywhere. You're going to have to boycott and pull together, or this movement will not work. So this isn't haphazard. This isn't just sing kumbaya and hold hands and everything's going to be okay. It's an active process. It's very specific on how he challenges this inequality in different places. And he is going to agitate many different people, but he is going to do this in a very different process. His beliefs are very different than that of Malcolm X for most of Malcolm's life. But then he also is going to be assassinated 3 years later in 1968, and this is going to cause a massive rift in the Democratic Party as well, because not only will Martin Luther King Jr. be assassinated, but so will Bobby Kennedy, who was a major civil rights activist as well. So really, if you want a side by side, just kind of bring it back. Martin Luther King is more from a middle class family, and Malcolm X is going to be on the kind of lower end of the socioeconomic status. Martin Luther King Jr. is in the South, Malcolm X is in the North. They don't have the same background. Martin Luther King has much more privilege than Malcolm X does. Martin Luther King is going to advocate more for nonviolent direct action, nonviolent resistance, right? So it's active agitation and questioning things, but he's not going to use violence to fight back. And Malcolm X is going to advocate for self-defense. It's not going out and attacking other people, but if you are attacked, fight back. Martin Luther King is actively going to call for integration. What's interesting about Malcolm X is not everybody wanted integration. Some people thought that, even black leaders thought that segregation was fine, that we're going to have our own communities that are going to be united, and we should be able to police and govern our own communities, that black leaders should govern black communities, and white leaders can govern their own white communities, but they should be able to be left alone. Meanwhile, Martin Luther King really wanted to call for this heavy integration. But one thing that Martin Luther King is able to do is he's able to unite people of different colors, not just blacks, but whites who have a larger access to financial means that help really fund this movement. And there are many different critiques of each group. So, for example, a lot of people question Martin Luther King's ability. He was too young, many people said. They weren't assertive enough, they weren't doing enough, that they were too passive, that this isn't getting any actual change. Meanwhile, Malcolm X is being claimed of kind of being a fearmonger, of doing things just for own personal gain, not really for the glory of the rest of the group and for actual equality. So there are many critics on both sides. Ultimately, we can look further into this movement that it's not just Malcolm X that does not agree with Martin Luther King Jr. Towards the end of Martin Luther King's life, he is going to have a couple interactions with a man by the name of Stokely Carmichael, who's going to be the founder of the Black Power movement. He is really going to push for this idea that nonviolent protest, like it worked in the early 60s, but now it's not really a viable means of actually ending things by the end. That you need to be able to combat racism. You need to be able to push equality. You can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. You have to keep this momentum going, and it's going to really bring about this willingness to fight with violence. Fight if you are violently attacked. That yes, you can fight back. That you must stand your ground. You must be fervent in this, and it's going to lead to the rise of different groups like the Black Panther Party. There are going to be this. There's going to be this larger movement of this swing from King's movement towards things that really take over with the new generation, like Stokely Carmichael. And there's a couple of reasons why. The lack of practical success by the end of the 1960s, but then also the death of major leaders. Malcolm X, assassinated, 1965. 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated. 1963, JFK was already killed. 1968 as well, Bobby Kennedy, JFK's brother, huge champion for civil rights, he is also killed. And so there's going to be a lot of conflict going on, not to mention the Vietnam War is sucking a lot of this political focus and a lot of this monetary focus away from actually gaining practical rights. It's going to just create more and more and more conflict. This is just a quote from Stokely Carmichael, and not everybody got along in this movement. There was division inside the movement, just like there was division for the 15th Amendment amongst women activist groups about what was the correct thing to do. Should they support the 15th Amendment? Should they not? Carmichael is going to give this massive speech at the end of a huge walk and a rally at night in a park. And there's actually a picture of him giving that speech, the Black Power speech. It says Dr. King's major assumption was that if you are nonviolent, if you suffer, your opponent will see your suffering and will be moved to change his heart. That's very good. He made one fallacious false assumption. In order for nonviolence to work, your opponent must have a conscience. That these people, these oppressors, are not people of heart, of good conscience, that these people are evil, and that's why this must be stopped. You're going to see people like the Black Panthers that are heavily influenced by the work of Malcolm X after his assassination, and are really going to push for a revolution in order to gain equality, that this isn't going to come by this kind of slow fade. You're going to need a lot of organization. They're going to adopt what's called the 10-point program that really calls for Black empowerment, ending oppression, this control of different institutions and different services in the African American communities, that Black should police Black communities. White officers and white officials should not be governing Black communities because they don't know what's best for them. Now, the Black Panthers are probably going to be known for most people as a very violent militant group. Their whole idea starts is to combat police brutality in Oakland, providing services like education and free lunches for children, but they're going to be heavily radicalized by the end of the 1960s, and it's going to lead to their disbandment. They would openly carry weapons, and so the public perception was these people were dangerous and willing and wanting to fight, which isn't necessarily the case in their original conception, but they become a little bit more diluted and they become much more radicalized by the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s before they eventually just disband. The person that created the Black Panthers, Dr. Huey Newton, even speaks on it a little bit further about why he believes what he believes. The blood, sweat, tears, and suffering of Black people are the foundation of wealth and power of the United States. We were forced to build America, and if forced to, we will tear it down. That's a revolution, right? The immediate cause of this destruction will be the suffering and bloodshed, but the end result will be perpetual peace for all mankind. There will be a bloody revolution, but it's going to lead to peace negotiations in the future. So the ends justify the means. These are pictures of Black Panthers. They would dress in similar uniforms. They would kind of be the police force for these Black communities. They would all dress the same in a similar way that other fighting forces have uniforms as well. Their mantra or their motto would be power flows from the barrel of a gun. That they would really push for this movement that you have to kind of actively fight through power. You can't expect all of this change to happen by just asking for it. You have to go take it. It was either the ballot, right? You give us equal access to voting rights, or it's the bullets, right? Move on over, or we'll move on over you. The problem is with all of these things happening simultaneously, there is division within the civil rights movement. Number one reasons why the civil rights movement loses its steam, it loses its ability to create a lot of tangible results in the later part of the 1960s, like it saw at the earlier part of the 1960s. Remember here, folks, this is more opportunities for complexity, is because of two major reasons. Number one, the Vietnam War is going to suck attention, it's going to suck finances, and people are going to put the domestic changes like the Great Society and the biggest component of that that we're talking about right now, the civil rights movement, and even the war on poverty on the back burner, because people will be funneling their attention and their focus towards the Vietnam War, not towards the civil rights movement. It's going to be seen as extra. The other thing that happens is they're going to lose a lot of their major leaders via assassination, and it's going to completely have this movement sort of start to crumble. The assassination of Malcolm X happens in the middle of the 1960s, so right around the time of the Selma marches and the passage of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place, but I'm not concerned with that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed for me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over, I've seen the promised land, and I may not get there with you. This is Martin Luther King's last speech he gives in 1968 before his life is all by James Earl Ray in 1968. So all of this change is happening. This is during kind of the middle end part of the primaries for the Democratic Party. So they lose this leader. They lose Bobby Kennedy as well, who is supposed to be the figure for the Democratic Party who's going to carry the civil rights movement. And so there's so much tension throughout the United States. They don't have a unified leadership. They don't have a unified direction. They don't have that tangible organization, and they're going to fail to create more successes moving forward. But we can look, did the civil rights movement actually obtain its goals? And a lot of people look at Martin Luther King's work as almost it's unfinished, like this statue in this cartoon. That there is much equality that is gained. You can look at de jure segregation being ended, de jure equality legally. There's all these things, but de facto, did it change everything? As a matter of fact, somewhat, but did it completely change everything? Absolutely not. Because if that was the case, there would be no hatred, there would be no discrimination, there would be no prejudice, there would be no racism today, but we also know that's not true. But there are massive leaps and bounds that they make. So just as one kind of slide for a conclusion, the civil rights movement is when we finally get equality, political equality for Black Americans in this country. And it happens in the 50s when we start with Brown versus the Board of Education. It's kind of culminated in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that eliminates the final kind of cusp of Jim Crow. Now understand this movement. You have Brown versus the Board of Education that desegregates public schools. You have the Civil Rights Act of 1964 that bans segregation in all other public facilities. You're going to have the 24th Amendment that removes poll taxes. But then the last nail in the coffin to old Jim Crow, to bury him for good, is going to be the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You can see a huge fight and a movement for social and economic equality. And it's going to see really a lot of successes. However, in the later part of the 1960s, it's going to be a departure from this nonviolent Martin Luther King style movement to a much more radicalized movement, the Black Power movement, the Black Panther Party, that's really going to take this and run with it as it goes on. Martin Luther King will not be around. Neither of the major Kennedys will be around. Even Malcolm X, who eventually starts turning into more of a King style philosophy, is not going to be around either. And ultimately, the Black civil rights successes really inspired so many other groups to strive for equality. The African American civil rights movement is the largest, the most vocal, the most seen, the most progressive change that we see during this time period. And it's going to inspire the Brown Power movement, the Pink Power movement, the Rainbow Power movement, the Red Power movement, the Yellow Power movement. It's going to inspire the hippies protest and the student rights protest. And all of these things are happening at the same time during the 50s and 60s. So what you can really do in these different videos that we've talked about, if you get an essay on either one of these topics, you can contextualize an argument about the civil rights movement with the Vietnam War, right, for example, or what's happening with the Cold War, and vice versa. If you're talking about Cold War changes in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, you can contextualize that with different civil rights movements that are really gaining steam during this time period. So if you have any questions, I know it was a really big video, but there's a lot of good information here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me and drop a comment down in the section below.